So I want to move on to another topic now, and it's the topic of witch trials.
Yeah, I hear a lot about that too.
Yeah, this is one of the common ones that's brought up in an attempt to show that Christianity is harmful to human flourishing. And I mean, this one really it really bothers me. um, any truth to it at all? It's disturbing. It's disturbing. But again, we're going to apply, and we're going to see that there are major exaggerations here in with the narrative that we're normally heard. And there's way more mitigating circumstances. I mean, far more than we can actually get into. And I toyed with the idea of just summarizing this thing up with in a couple of paragraphs. But I think our listeners, our viewers, will understand or want to know a little bit more. So we're going to try to break it down a little bit more. But let me just jump right in with this. I'm going to start with a quote by C.S. Lewis. He helps put this into perspective for us. 300 years ago, people in England were putting witches to death. Was that what you call the rule of human nature or right conduct? Now, this is a little bit of a dated quote from him. So by that phrase, rule of human nature or right conduct, he's referring to the discussions taking place in the 40s and 50s that were talking about universal rights and so on and so forth. But surely the reason is to continue the quote. But surely the reason that we do not execute witches is that we do not believe there are such things. If we did, if we really thought that there were people going about who had sold themselves to the devil and received supernatural powers from him in return, and were using these powers to kill their neighbors or drive them mad or bring bad weather, surely we would all agree that if anyone deserved the death penalty, then these filthy quislings did. And he adds, there's no difference of moral principle here. The difference is simply about matter of fact. It may be a great advance in knowledge not to believe in witches. There is no moral advance, though, in not executing them when you do not think that there are any. You would not call a man humane for ceasing to set mousetraps if he did so because he believed there were no mice in the house. So that's found in Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. And so I think he's onto something there. You know, if you don't think that there's witches, then there's nothing to worry about. But if you really do think that such exist and are getting powers and are harming people, then it makes sense to stop them from doing it.
Yeah, and there's also, that brings to mind again the cultural influence too, that we're not just dealing with what Jesus taught here. In fact, it's quite a bit different, but the culture of the day, according to Lewis and other sources, the culture of the day simply thought there were people who could actually had these powers, very destructive and dangerous powers. And yet you don't see that kind of a witch in the Bible. I mean, this must be coming from somewhere else, and it was rampant within the culture of the day to believe that there were people had that kind of power.
Right. And I'm gonna describe how this came about and the strange way in which Christian thinking actually, unfortunately, contributed to this. Let me begin with the exaggerations. In all of these topics, that's one of the things that we discovered is that the claims and the narratives that we've been taught from the Enlightenment time are exaggerated. And the claims that we've been taught are 9 to 10 million people in Europe and thousands in America were burned at the stake by the Inquisition. That's basically the narrative. Well, Rodney Stark, the sociologist that we refer to often here, says perhaps no historical statistics have been so outrageously inflated as the numbers executed as witches during the craze that took place in Europe from about 1450 to 1700. Many writers have placed the final death toll at 9 million and drawing comparisons with the Holocaust, of course. And while it's acknowledged that Protestants burned a lot of witches too, historians have stressed the leading role played by the Inquisition. It's widely claimed that the witch hunts ended only when the so-called Dark Ages of religious extremism were overthrown by the supposed Enlightenment. And Stark says, vicious nonsense, all of it. The entire description is not only nonsense, it's vicious nonsense. So let's start with America. The Salem witch trials in the United States, or at that point, America, but not the United States yet. Here we may have an example of people with the right heart attitude, reasoning incorrectly, and making terrible mistakes in judgment, resulting in actions that were not only inappropriate, but terribly and horribly wrong. Between June and September of 1692, 6 men and 14 women were eventually convicted and executed, 19 of them by hanging, because English law called for death penalty for witchcraft. Over 150 others were imprisoned. Things finally ended in September of 1692 when the governor, William Phips, dissolved the court and said enough of this insanity. The colony's leading minister ended the witch hunt, and those that remained in prison were released. Then the judge that was presiding over the trials publicly confessed his guilt in 1697. And in 1711, the colony's legislatures made reparation to the heirs of the victims, and they annulled the convictions. So it seemed that the witch hunt was a result of theological misapplication, and the people who were involved were penitent. They were sorry for what they did and admitted it was wrong. The whole witch hunt lasted only a year. 16 people were hanged in New England for witchcraft prior to 1692, and then in 1692, 20 more were executed. So you've got 36 people and 150 people imprisoned. Now, this is not at all to diminish or minimize the impact of the American witch hunts, which resulted in 36 deaths. But 36 is not millions. It's not hundreds of thousands. It's not even hundreds. It's 36. This was not a genocide, but it was a horrible error of judgment. The bigger problem comes when we start looking at the European witch executions. But here, again, we have exaggeration. According to Brian Pavlik, professor of history who specializes in this area, he says, how many witch executions were there in Europe? He says the best estimates of recent historians range from 50 to 200,000 dead. Oh, that's a huge number. So there's something horribly wrong that took place here, and I want to admit that right up front again. But the earlier estimates, Pavlik says, which too often were given as 9 to 10 million, which is just what Stark said as well, were grossly exaggerated. No respectable historian supports them anymore. Modern figures concerning the number of executed witches are based on much closer examination of the surviving historical records, combined with reasonable guesswork and statistical analysis for those areas and periods lacking clear sources. So I don't want to minimize the impact of 50 to 200,000 lives lost. But it's a much smaller number, much smaller number over a longer period of time than what has been claimed in the past. So we're talking 36 people in America, 50 to 200,000 in Europe, but we're not talking millions at all. So Stark says, as for the death toll, in recent years, competent scholars have carefully assembled the evidence nation by nation and found the accepted totals to be utterly fantastic. By accepted, he puts it in quotes. He's referring to the earlier narrative totals, and those totals to be utterly fantastic. And he's using the word fantastic in its literal sense, unbelievable. They shouldn't be believed. For example, he says, it has long been assumed that in England, between 1600 and 1680, about 42,000 witches were burnt. But the most trustworthy figure turns out to be fewer than 1,000 over a period of 3 centuries. In similar fashion, the best estimate, the final death toll, is not 9 million, but about 60,000 is what he says. But even that is a tragic total, and I want to admit that right from the front. But let's back up now, and what's the history? How did this type of thinking take root in the culture? And Pavlik says, during the Middle Ages, the predominant Christian view of witchcraft was that it was an illusion. So the church's view is that witchcraft was an illusion. People might think they were witches, but they were fooling themselves. Or the devil was fooling them, maybe, at most. Most authorities thought that witchcraft could do no serious harm because it wasn't real. Stark says there was a concept of magic, and what people were doing was practicing magic in their thinking. And there was a critical distinction between church and non-church magic. Apparently, church magic was plentiful. Sacred wells, springs, groves, shrines abounded where supplicants could seek all sorts of miracles and blessings. Priests had an extensive array of incantations, prayers, and rites available for dealing with many human concerns, especially for treating illness. And there were many priests who specialized in exorcism. And parallel to this elaborate system of church magic was an extensive culture of folk or traditional magic, a substantial portion of which also was devoted to treating medical problems. So Stark says some of this magic dated from pre-Christian times, and some of it was a somewhat jumbled adaptation of church magic. In other words, the culture and church teaching got mixed up, got mixed together. And when that happens, there's great danger for the culture to be influencing church teaching.
And we should also just remind ourselves that a lot of times there's a difference between church teaching and Jesus's teaching. And especially if the church teaching gets mixed up or influenced by the culture, which we still see to this day.
Correct. Yeah, that's a important point to make as well. But there is a way in which Christianity, some good teaching of Christianity got involved here. And this is the way Stark describes it. And Stark is a big fan of the Christian commitment to reason. His whole analysis of the impact of Christianity on history comes down to what he calls the victory of reason. It's through Christianity that reason became paramount in the West. And that's another whole story to get into, but here's how it connects with today's topic of witches. Christianity is a theological religion, Stark says. It isn't satisfied with mystery and meditation, but relentlessly seeks to ground its entire system of beliefs in logic and reason. This has many admirable features, including the way the Christian commitment to rationalism, and I think by that he just means the use of reason, provided a model for the development of Western science, as we just saw in our previous topic. But when confronted with magic, this aspect of Christianity turned out to have tragic consequences. This is going to be an example of a good and true idea being abused, either intentionally or unintentionally. And something that I've discovered recently is that I think almost any good idea can be abused. And this is what ended up happening here. So the ancient Romans and Greeks devoted little or no effort to explaining why magic works, as it appears to do, at least some of the time. But Christian thinkers demanded to know why magic works. They wanted to figure it out. A clear answer could easily be provided why church magic works, it's God, Jesus, the Holy Ghost, sometimes Mary, various saints and angels who were the active agents. When church magic failed, it was because these supernatural beings had decided it should not work in a given instance. Clearly, however, Stark says these hallowed figures did not cause non-church magic to work. Well, who did then? The answer seemed equally obvious within Christian theology. Evil supernatural beings. And that is Satan and demons. So non-church magic works because Satan empowers it. Hence, to practice non-church magic constituted invoking Satan and his demons. And that is the definition of witchcraft. That's what sets witchcraft apart from magic. It was adding the idea of Satan and his demons as the cause to the alleged efficacy of the magic. And so from there was a short, obvious step to deducing that thousands of wise ones, which was a term given to people who practiced this magic, all across Europe were therefore involved in satanic dealings. That must have been the source. So this is sad and unfortunate. The European conception of witchcraft was entirely the product of theological reflection. There wasn't any basis for it in the popular magical culture. It resulted from a desire of the literate elite, not the pagan peasant, but the literate elite to make sense of magic. And thus Stark says it was the university professors who played the leading roles in generating and sustaining the terrible witch hunts that stormed across Europe. Yikes.
Yeah, university professors. I wonder how that works today. We are seeing some controversy in the university level nowadays, but that would probably be another topic.
Yeah, one which we should probably cover sometime. So Pavlik says in 1484, Pope Innocent VIII, in his bull Summus Desiderantes, let the Inquisition pursue witches. So this is an example now of the culture being influenced by the theology, and then the culture influencing, putting political pressure, I think, on the church leadership to do something about the alleged problem. In any case, just about that same time, within the next 50 years, so the church broke apart because of the Reformation. While Roman Catholicism redefined itself under a papal magisterium that was the source of authority for Roman Catholic teaching, Lutheranism, Calvinism, and Anglicanism asserted other sources for divine authority. Surprisingly, though, Protestant reformers often agreed with Rome that witches were a clear and present danger, and all four of the major Western Christian churches, Roman Catholic, Lutheran, Calvinist, and Anglican, persecuted witches to some degree or another. Apparently, Eastern Christian or Orthodox churches carried out almost no witch hunting. So none of these persecutions, though, this is a key point, could have been carried out without the permission and cooperation of secular governments. They really were the key to this whole thing, based on the research that I've done. Secular princes ultimately decided, for the most part, whether or not witches were hunted. Although princes hunted witches often because church leaders taught them that witches were disturbers of the peace, destructors of property, and killers of animals and people. But if our culture believed that, our government would take action. And the princes, they were the government, so to speak, of the time. So efforts to expose and suppress evil in the form of non-church magic soon led to public panics in many parts of Europe. All sorts of lurid tales and fears spread rapidly, and especially in places where governance was weak. And then you get mobs and local authorities getting swept up in the witchcraft craze. But there's something interesting about the way that the Inquisition responded to this issue, and it's the opposite of the narrative that we've been told. The inquisitors viewed themselves as doctors, spiritual doctors, and they were trying to heal people. They weren't trying to kill people. They were trying to heal people with the Inquisition, and we've seen that at times they went overboard, but that was their approach, and they approached the accused people of any sort of heresy with a sympathetic ear, because they were trying to heal these people. And so they came up with a crucial distinction between the implicit and explicit invocation of demons. Thus, they assumed that most accused of non-church magic, including priests, were sincere Catholics who meant no harm and had been unaware of invoking demons. While it was wrong even to have implicitly invoked demons, it should be forgiven in the ordinary way through confession and absolution. So consequently, the Spanish Inquisition sent nearly no witches to the stake. And those who were, very small number, were convicted for the third or fourth time and just refused to stop. Even more important, the Inquisition used its power and its influence to suppress witch hunting by the local mobs or secular authorities. So, ironically, despite the nearly universal belief to the contrary, the earliest, most vigorous, and most effective opposition to the witch hunts came from the Spanish Inquisition, who was usually labeled the worst bad guy of all in the medieval times. It was the Inquisitors who never lost sight of the fact that these wise ones were performing magic in good conscience. They just thought that it worked and were not knowingly involved in pacts with the devil. So this is interesting to me, and it even goes further. The evidence shows that the Inquisition is what played a major role in ending the witch hunts. Not only were they not the key perpetrators of them, they were the key group in ending it. So Stark says it needs to be recognized that a mere handful of these victims, that is, people convicted in witch trials, were sentenced to death by the Spanish Inquisition. So few that during the century 1540 to 1640, which was when the witch hunts were at their peak in most of Europe, the Inquisition of Aragon, which is one of the two Spanish Inquisitions, executed only 12 people for superstition and witchcraft. I mean, still, I hate even saying that. That's horrible. But we're talking tiny numbers compared to what was happening in the rest of the culture. And this should have been acknowledged all along, but it wasn't. The narrative we've been told did not tell the truth about this. Even the virulently anti-Catholic historian Henry C. Lee in the 19th century agreed that witch hunting was rendered comparatively harmless in Spain, and this was due to the wisdom and firmness of the Inquisition. So this evidence was out there 200 years ago, but it wasn't part of the narrative that we were told. So the Spanish Inquisition, some of its worst points was, and we didn't really discuss this when we were discussing the Inquisition just because there's so much to talk about. But one of the things they did that was a problem is they moved on from dealing with heresy found among believers to dealing with non-Christians like Muslims and Jews, and fears that those people were causing harm to society. And that was called the conversos. Those people were called the conversos. And after that problem was resolved and I'm skipping over a huge area here. But the Spanish Inquisition remained officially active by broadening its scope to include all manner of heresies, including witchcraft. So it did move on to witchcraft. And the Inquisition could be brutal towards alleged and confessed witches. 6 witches, for example, were burned alive in Logroño on Sunday, November 7th, 1610. But the more striking part of the evidence is the broad skepticism of inquisitors toward popular claims of witchcraft. This is really interesting. Records show that key investigators like Francisco Vaca, around 1549, and Alfonso Salazar, 1611, insisted that most accusations and personal confessions of sorcery were either entirely false or the result of mental illness and or small town hysteria. Salazar wrote, "I have not found the slightest evidence from which to infer that a single act of witchcraft has really occurred. Indeed, my previous suspicions have been strengthened by new evidence from the visitation, that the evidence of the accuser alone, without external proof, is insufficient to justify arrest. And further, in the increased state of the public mind, every agitation of the matter is harmful and increases the evil. I deduce, therefore, the importance of silence. There were neither witches nor bewitched until they were talked about and written about." That's like today when a massive killing takes place. There is some emphasis put on just not talking much about that person or writing about their manifesto, because all it does is just promote further violent acts. And so that was his thinking here, because he didn't think most of it was real at all, which goes back to C.S. Lewis's quote at the beginning. And so Stark says the Spanish Inquisition had a somewhat enlightened approach to sorcery, at least compared to the thousands of witch trials and executions, maybe as high as 50,000, carried out in Germany, France, and England during the 15 and 1600s. Witch trials certainly had the support of the churches. However, thanks to archival studies since the 1970s, so we're talking about just the last 50 years, Malcolm Gaskill, professor of early modern history at the University of East Anglia, writes, "It is clear that the witch craze was essentially a secular legal phenomenon. The reason is," end of quote, "the reason is clear. Witchcraft was viewed as a public menace and even as a deadly weapon. It was incumbent on secular authorities to protect the populace. It's no wonder that the peak periods of witch hunting, 1620s to 1650s, roughly coincided with wars, plagues, and failure of harvests. So public panic laid the blame on witches, and unfortunately 80% of them, according to our records, were women." So the emphasis of the Inquisition was the preaching of sermons about witchcraft should especially be avoided, because there were neither witches nor bewitched until they're talked about and written about. And Salazar's report soon circulated widely among churchmen all across Europe. And other Catholic clergy, including the Jesuit Friedrich von Spee, soon joined in denouncing witch hunts. And it was their influence, and especially their discrediting of evidence gained by torture, that brought witch burning to an end in Catholic areas, an effect that soon seeped into Protestant areas as well. But it began with the Catholic inquisitors. So I find that fascinating. It's quite different than the narrative that we've been fed. Still some awful things happened, but large exaggerations there for sure.
Yeah, well, you do see a tendency even today for people to, for various conspiracy theories to get quite a wide following. Now, we have the internet to help fuel them, but back in the day when you didn't have various internet sites to debunk certain theories that weren't around, they could go unchecked. And I guess we can't really look at ourselves I'm not you and me personally necessarily, but look at today's society and say, oh, we would never go for any conspiracy theory. People are, these weird and wonderful things. But all you have to do is go online and you'll see there are whole sections, whole demographics that have embraced various really quite wild conspiracy theories. So it's
Yeah,
not,
and you don't
it's
have
not
to be
something.
religious.
No,
You don't
that's
have,
the point.
yeah.
You don't have to. In fact, a lot of these people are not religious. In fact, there's some new surveys or studies come out, and I have papers on my computer that talk about that, as people abandon belief in God or Christianity, they become more susceptible to believing in various forms of superstition. And that's something we're worth checking out as well down the road.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is not to say that religious people don't get involved in these conspiracies, because they
No.
do. In
No,
fact,
there's always.
if you remember the satanic ritual scare in the 80s, I just discovered through some research that initiated right here in Canada, in my own province, British Columbia. The two people, a psychiatrist and one of his patients, was the origin of that whole thing. It ended up being a huge, big scare and sent people to prison, people falsely accused, and it carried on for 10 years or so. And I remember listening to a Christian evangelist, making a big deal about that, and just kind of wondering, well, this stuff sounds so weird. I was highly skeptical of it, and the truth came out. The whole thing was not intentionally done, but just based on exaggeration, beginning with the psychiatrist and his client, and then they made money on it and wrote a book on it. And yeah, it can happen, and anybody is susceptible to giving into this sort of stuff.
Yeah.
I do want to add here that the other difference between what really happened and the narrative we've been fed is that this didn't happen in the Middle Ages. This was not part of these so-called Dark Ages or medieval times. This happened during the Renaissance and the early modern period. So the witch hunts were just getting started. So Stark says, consider the witch hunts reached their height during the so-called Enlightenment. Indeed, writing in his celebrated book Leviathan in 1651, Thomas Hobbes, famous English philosopher and proponent in the Enlightenment, wrote that, quote, as for witches, they are justly punished. Another leading figure of the Enlightenment, Jean Baudin, another leading figure, Jean Baudin, served as a judge at several witchcraft trials and advocated burning witches in the slowest possible fires. And even distinguished scientists like Robert Boyle encouraged witch hunts. So this is so interesting. So atheist historian Tim O'Neill, who actually contacted me after I did a debate with Richard Carrier on Carrier's view on that Jesus never really existed. I get this email from an atheist saying, why did you debate this guy? This guy's stuff is out to lunch, So I appreciate what Tim O'Neill does. He's he challenges a lot of this Enlightenment narrative that we've been fed. So here's what he says: the traditional mythic depiction of the Renaissance tends to ignore this context of violence, bloodshed, and exploitation that was its backdrop, to make the contrast with the darker and more superstitious Middle Ages more stark. But wars became more extensive, more destructive, and more deadly in the early modern period, dwarfing anything that took place in the Middle Ages. The witch craze, something else roped into the conception of medieval in popular culture, was not a medieval phenomenon. It was early modern. And then he sarcastically says, yet somehow the term the witch hunts of the Renaissance and Enlightenment would sound wrong to most people. Yeah. But that's when it happened. It happened during the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. And some historians, Stark says, like to claim that witch hunting finally ended because it was attacked by participants in the Enlightenment, like Balthasar and Becker. But not true. None of these enlightened attacks on witch hunts appeared until nearly a century after efforts by the Catholic clergy had discredited the witch craze and made it entirely safe to say such things.
Hmm.
So again, that part of the narrative isn't quite right. This isn't part of the barbaric dark ages where the church was in control and leading people to believe all sorts of crazy superstitious stuff. No, it was the church that actually led people out of this crazy belief that was a mix of wrongly applied reason, which is good, but just made a mistake there, and other cultural pagan beliefs that had got mixed up with other Catholic beliefs, and it was just part of the whole culture. Very hard to move against, but eventually the Inquisition was finally able to move against it, and then picked up by Protestants, and then eventually Enlightenment thinkers, and put it to it. Now,
well,
we
that's
don't
been
have
fascinating,
time.
Michael.
Yeah, I know that our time is limited here, and there is other stuff that I do want to say about this, but I'm going to save it to the next session, where we're going to talk a little, just briefly, about the causes, and some further about the right ways to think about our response to this, because it is still troubling to me, but I think there's a better way to respond to it than the sort of atheistic Enlightenment narrative still wants to respond to it in this way. So leave that to our next time together.
Well, I'll look forward to that. I think that'll be a positive, constructive way to kind of tie up the loose ends here that everybody can hopefully benefit from. Well, thanks again, Michael, for your input. It's been very interesting, and I'll look forward to the next episode.
Yeah. Thanks, Kirk. I enjoyed it.
Okay, bye for now.
Bye-bye.